John, it's great to connect again today. Not only were you my torts professor at law school, you were also my teammate in a bunch of pickup games at Arriaga, and we won a bunch of games together. In large part because you are tenacious on the basketball court. So it's great to be able to catch up with you again today.
Yeah, although my memory is that your skill was the big part in those victories. But anyway, great to catch up, Nate.
Well, John, as you think back on your research and teaching, are there any simple, practical, underappreciated lessons you've learned that you'd most like to pass along to others?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a bunch of things that have come to me over the years. When I graduated with a Ph.D. in economics and decided I'd go into law teaching, my orientation was to try to focus on empirical research that might shed light on good public policy. And that's what I've been doing ever since, and had some good success in some areas. But also, if you do this sort of work, and I think you're thoughtful and reflective, you also see that there are some big challenges. So, if I look back, one particular project I worked on was quite intriguing to me. I I was asked by a great lawyer in Connecticut who I didn't know, but I had known of him for years. And he asked me to do an empirical evaluation of the Connecticut death penalty as part of his challenge in litigation to the Connecticut death penalty. And so that was back in September of 2006. And I asked them, how much time is this going to take? Because I was a little busy at the time. At that moment, I was a professor at Yale Law School, and he said, "Well, the report's due in 3 months, so it's relatively short duration." And so I thought I was signing on for 3 months of hard work. It ended up being 10 years. So it was like fighting the Trojan War. But ultimately, we ended up with a decision by the Connecticut Supreme Court that eliminated the death penalty in Connecticut. And so that was a very interesting experience for me across the board in terms of the empirical work that I did, but also seeing litigation and legislation, because there was some legislation along the way, and also just to work with a very talented lawyer who was not an empiricist, but see him learn. I would teach him, and then he would make the arguments as a lawyer in court. So many interesting lessons from that 10-year project.
So as you think back on that, in terms of the death penalty, there's some, theoretical, philosophical arguments for and against the death penalty, but you approach this from an empirical point of view. And what were the empirics? Like, what was the most persuasive factor in your mind that led the state to overturning the death penalty?
Yeah, great question. I have over time had sort of embraced this idea that two things I'd like my work to do are reduce suffering in the world and improve things when we can. And so for the death penalty, it was an interesting process for me because, of course, if there's a deterrent value of the death penalty, then it's a little bit of a trade-off. The death penalty itself imposes suffering on obviously the person who's executed, but also their family. But if there's a big deterrent value, then that cuts against that harm. And so I had done some work over a period of a couple of years with a brilliant colleague then at Stanford named Justin Wolfers. And we really spent a couple of years just trying to see if there was any deterrent value from the death penalty in the US. And we concluded there wasn't. So then it made it an easier decision for me that if there wasn't a deterrent value, then I thought the death penalty was all cost and no benefit. And interestingly, in 1764, an Italian theorist by the name of Cesare Beccaria had written a paper on the death penalty. It was the first real criminology oriented paper written in Europe. And he had said that he felt the death penalty was not a deterrent, and therefore it could not be a just punishment, since it was the mere imposition of harm without any offsetting benefit. And so, interestingly, I sort of came to that same conclusion, but it was after spending a few years looking at the empirical evidence on deterrence and the death penalty. So then, when I was asked to do the Connecticut death penalty litigation, it was a busy point in time for me. But I thought, well, I've just spent 2 years looking at the deterrence, and so I'd come to this conclusion. It was good to get rid of it. So when they asked me to do the study, I sort of jumped in, and it was an interesting process because the lawyer said, "Look, we think the death penalty is bad in a number of ways, but we're not empirical researchers, and the Connecticut Supreme Court has instructed us to get an empirical researcher to evaluate the death penalty. So we want you to do the evaluation." And they really didn't give me too much guidance. They just let me run with it. And I looked at the way the system worked and concluded there was a lot of arbitrariness. Depending on where a murder was occurred, there was either no chance that you would get the death penalty because the prosecutor was quite opposed, or if you happened to be in Waterbury, Connecticut, then there was a very good chance because the prosecutor was very zealously attached. But then there were also racial disparities, which were pretty extreme and unexplained, and just a general arbitrariness that some relatively less heinous crimes would get the death penalty, and some of the most atrocious crimes did not. So I just put the entire case before the first in the litigation setting, but the Connecticut legislature ran with the report and eliminated the death penalty, but only prospectively. So then there was litigation. Would it be constitutional to retain the death penalty for those on death row when the state had eliminated it prospectively? And at the end of the day, the court said, given all of the problems with the death penalty that were identified in this report, they considered it to be unconstitutional at that point, once the legislature had eliminated it prospectively.
Well, this is really interesting to me and timely because literally yesterday afternoon, I finished the book, The Sun Does Shine, which is about Anthony Ray Hinton, who was on death row for 28 years. And it was the work of Brian Stevenson that helped free Anthony, wrongly convicted. They had, the only evidence was basically a gun that was found at his mom's house that the prosecution said, the prosecution eventually couldn't even match the bullets to the gun, and that was their only evidence. And what I learned from that book was, to your point, just how arbitrary the death penalty can be many times. And in the book, it also said that the evidence shows that about 1 in 10 of people who have been executed, at least in the death penalty in Alabama, were after the fact. They expected them to have been innocent. So you're looking at I don't know what rate would be acceptable. For many people, it would be 0 innocent people ever being executed, but 1 out of 10 was just shockingly high.
Yeah, and Brian Stevenson is quite a talent. I saw him a few months ago give a lecture, and he really is almost a mesmerizing speaker. But yeah, that has been my experience. That sometimes, you just think about one of the verities of life seems to be that 5% of any profession seems to be somewhat problematic, and that's true for law professors, doctors, teachers, um, police, and I think it's also true for prosecutors. And so, for that group of the less, less talented or less justice-oriented prosecutors, I think there are dangers of these types of misconduct. And I saw it in Connecticut. There was one guy who committed a murder on January 3rd, 1988. I remember it because it was my daughter's birthday. And he spent 20 years in prison, and I could not believe that the prosecutor got this guy convicted, and he used a jailhouse snitch who was completely incredible as a witness, not credible as a witness, to secure the conviction. And so that really troubled me. And it turned out that that was the prosecutor who was up against me in this challenge to the Connecticut death penalty. And I just saw him up close, and I said, this is not a person of good judgment. And yet that is one of the problems with having the death penalty, that people who are not always of good judgment are making very important decisions on life or death matters. And I think, everybody should be at least a little bit concerned about that, no matter how you feel about the death penalty. Just reflect on the cases where people without good judgment are making those decisions.
Well, in your work, John, aiming to reduce suffering and improve things, what an accomplishment to be able to have such an impact on society. But because of your goal to reduce suffering and improve things, you end up doing research and spending your time on some pretty controversial issues, such as gun control and abortion and civil rights. Um, as you think about other lessons that you would most like to pass on, are there any in these other areas that you would like to discuss?
Yeah, well, the gun area has been a very interesting one for me. Uh, I got into it sort of inadvertently, although I should say that um, when I came out of my graduate program in economics, which was in 1986, so I've been at this for a while. Um, the next 5 years were really quite terrible years in terms of increasing crime in the United States. So while I had been doing a lot of work with the brilliant Nobel Prize winning economist Jim Heckman in the area of do the civil rights laws impact the economic prospects of minorities, I sort of shifted over to crime because I was so alarmed at the increase in crime in the late 1980s. And at the end of that period, Judge Posner, a famous Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals judge and University of Chicago professor, asked me to review a book by John Lott for the first issue of the American Law and Economics Review that Posner had just become the editor of. And so that's how I ended up getting interested in the gun question. What happens when a state allows citizens to carry guns outside the home? Most states were quite restrictive 30, 40 years ago. In fact, Texas is quite remarkable in that from 1871 until 2005, excuse me, 1995, it actually prohibited the carrying of guns outside the home at all.
Wow.
So you were not able to, unless you were hunting, carry a gun outside the home. And so we have quite a different position today. So I just spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out what the truth was about what those impacts were. And along the way, there were some humbling lessons because John Lott did the first study, came out with a conclusion that he thought that the laws were actually beneficial. But we have since learned, his study came out originally, I think, in 1997, and we've since learned that many of the tools of econometrics were much less robust back then than they are today. So we've learned that even the way that we measured statistical significance was off in some of these early panel data studies, and so it's been a good lesson for me. You do the best you can with the state-of-the-art econometrics, and you have to be super careful if you're going to have any hope of really teasing out the causal relationships. But you always have to maintain a little humility because as has happened over the last 30 years, someone may come along and say, oh, that technique is really imperfect, and here's a better technique. And sometimes the better technique gives you a different answer than the first technique. So it turns out to be a lot harder than I originally anticipated when I started doing empirical work, to actually be sure that you have landed the correct result. And I think just yesterday, the New York Times had a big story about red wine and longevity. And I remember growing up hearing, red wine would be good for your heart. And now they just concluded a big study yesterday that almost all of that effect was generated by the fact that people who drink red wine tend to be more affluent and
Mhm.
higher up in the socioeconomic scale. And it's those features that are the basis for their greater longevity. And if anything, the wine is reducing their longevity. So it's a good lesson that empirical truths are not easily won, but that's at least the goal of my work, is to try to get there.
Well, that was one of the very first lessons on this podcast, was how to disentangle correlation from causation. And it's really one of the greatest challenges we have as humans, and we have econometrics and different techniques to help us, but we do continue to grow and learn. And John, I want to be sensitive to your time. I could listen to you for hours. There's so many other things we could talk about. You worked with Stephen Levitt, and I remember reading about your work in Freakonomics, and then also I have to say, one of my favorite class periods of yours. Well, I loved your class, but you did something that was fun, and you said, "Hey, I want you to debate climate change, and I'm going to leave." And you just left the classroom for about 20 minutes, and we had quite a fun discussion. Now, I don't know if that's because you had something else you had to do at the time, but the truth was that we had a really kind of interesting discussion. So I'm curious, is that something you still do, and is that a technique that maybe I need to adopt in my classes?
Yeah, I remember doing it that time, and part of it was that I just wanted to get a sense of whether being the professor sort of inhibited the free flow of discussion on sort of controversial topics. And so, what was your sense? Did it promote a little more freedom and piping up?
I mean, I felt like people did share freely, but I also think you did a good job as a professor allowing people to share regardless. So maybe people opened up a little bit more had you not been there, but I'm not sure, because like I said, I feel like you had a great culture in your class where people felt free to say what they thought, and you weren't out to try to make somebody look stupid or just kind of impose your view. I think your perspective of being an empiricist and just trying to approach it from the perspective of, here's what the data says, and we're trying to follow the data.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, good, good, good. Well, it was wonderful to have you in the class, and I'm so delighted you reached out to me so I could hear how well you've done since you left Stanford as well.
Well, it's just so great to catch up again. Like I said, I loved learning from you in law school, and I loved hearing you talk about this today, because, when we're taking torts, you didn't actually spend as much time on the death penalty work, right? Because it wasn't, necessarily quite on topic for torts. So it's just great to be able to learn from you today. I could, like I said, I could spend hours just listening to you talk about the work you did on abortion and the relation to crime, and work you've done for civil rights. So with that said, I just, again, want to say thank you. And it was so great to be able to chat again.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure, Nate. Thanks again.